Aside from the fact that there are even a lot of men who are stunted by this concept, there is a far more women who are objectionable to the idea of a man, particularly their own man, having multiple women. Well, on today's video, what I want to do is I want to refute, I want to combat, I want to debunk those common objections that people have to biblical polygamy, otherwise known as biblical polygyny, right after this.
Don't forget to like this video if you like it, click subscribe, click notifications for future contents, and don't forget to share it with a friend.
Hey family, what I want to do on today's video is I want to address the 10 common objections that people tend to have against polygyny, particularly biblical polygamy. That is the practice of a man having multiple women. And the reason why I want to address these is because they are often used to refute or to buff against just the idea of this biblical practice and lifestyle. And what I want to do is I want to dig into the word today. I want to give some facts, a little bit of data, and I want to dig into these objections because I want to reveal, or I want to expose, God's perspective on biblical polygamy or polygyny. That is, man having the practice and the lifestyle of having multiple wives. So the first objection that I want to address is one that is common used, that people often says that it is a sin or it is the very act of adultery. Nothing can be further than the truth. Many Christians love to use this objection. They love to make claim that somehow that polygyny or polygamy is one engaging in the act of adultery, or that it is just simply a sin. Well, the problem with that is, first and foremost, what does the Bible classify or denotes as a sin? What does the Bible define as a sin? 1 John, the 3rd chapter in the 4th verse, John tells us, one of Jesus' apostles, if anybody would have known, John would have known. John tells us that sin is the breaking of God's law, because sin is lawlessness. So if sin is the breaking of God's law, we need to discover, well, what law actually did God write that lets us know that polygyny is a sin? That means out of all of the laws, and we count the law of Moses, 613 laws, out of all of the laws that are in Scripture, there must be at least one law that states that the practice of a man having multiple wives is a sin, and not just a sin, but it's an act of an adultery. The problem, my friends, is that one can comb from Genesis to Revelation and cannot find not one law that states explicitly or implicitly that polygyny, a man having multiple wives, is a sin, or somehow it is the act of an adultery. You just can't find it. The other thing to factor in is on Moses himself. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the law, or the first 5 books of the Bible for that matter. And that is the containing of the law of God, the law that God gave to his children once he delivered them out of Egypt, out of bondage. And from Mount Sinai and throughout their time in the wilderness, Moses writes the laws that he received from God. And Moses is the one that we first read in the Bible who lets us know that God is against adultery. He says, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." But the problem for people who object to the idea of polygyny, Moses himself, while he wrote this, had at least 2 or 3 wives when he wrote, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," which makes one want to scratch their head and wonder, if Moses had no problem with writing that adultery is something that God prohibits, why would Moses have multiple wives when he wrote it? It seems Moses would have been in conflict with what he wrote. So obviously Moses had no problem with the idea of practicing having multiple wives while he wrote, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." Another fact about Moses is just a few verses down, the very next chapter over, we get Moses sanctioning the practice of polygyny, authorizing the practice of polygyny, elevating polygyny as something that restores or gives credence to the value of a woman, particularly a slave woman, having rights in a polygynous or a marital situation, giving us God's perspective. Moses, even further on in his writing of the law, even commands the practice through the Levirate law of polygyny. He commands it, yes. So what Moses reveals is that not only was he not against the practice of polygyny, but the God that inspired him to write what he wrote was not against the practice of polygyny. The other thing, my friends, if polygyny was somehow wrong, then that means that not only Moses was guilty of the practice of sin or the practice of adultery, as many claim it to be, then he should have been stoned to death. That means the actual punishments that Moses wrote, he was subjective or should have been subjected to being executed in that manner. Moses should have been stoned to death and his wives for the practice, or additional wives, for the practice of polygyny. Not only Moses should have been stoned, that means they should have dug up the grave, and Abraham should have been stoned, and Jacob should have been stoned, and Lamech should have been stoned, and that means Gideon should have been stoned, David should have been stoned, who was a man after God's own heart. Abraham was God's friend, okay? And so you have Elkanah, he should have been stoned. So you had so many men, not only who wrote scripture, who were prophets of God, who were anointed by God, who walked with God, who had the Spirit of God, had and lived the lifestyle of having multiple wives. If they were guilty of adultery, they should have been executed under the penalty of the law that Moses wrote. The second objection that people tend to have against biblical polygyny is they often like to say that, well, in the beginning, God created only one wife for the first man. Adam only had one wife, Eve, and not multiple wives. So that's often used as a common objection. But the problem with that perspective, which is really leaning from Jesus' discussion with the Pharisees in Matthew, the 19th chapter, when the Pharisees came to challenge Jesus. You know, this was at the point in his ministry where people started to follow him and he was getting notoriety. And they came to challenge him on this particular perspective because they often wanted to get him crossed up so that they can trump false charges against him, or challenge him so that they can get him to make a mistake or say something out of error so that they can lock him up. But in all reality, in their attempt to try to hoodwink Jesus just basically is addressing this issue of divorce that they are challenging him with. And oftentimes, this particular passage is used to say that Jesus somehow was stating that it was the practice from the beginning, the practice of a man having one wife and the two becoming one flesh means that the God of the Bible was against men having multiple wives. Well, the problem with using that particular argument or this particular passage to support that argument is the context. You know, the context is Jesus is talking about divorce. He's not addressing the issue of polygyny. And so this passage is often used to debunk against the idea of the practice of polygyny when it's not even addressing the subject of polygyny in and of itself. This has to deal with men divorcing their wives for any and every reason. But on this particular point, the fact that God created only one woman for the first man, Adam, if we use that line of reasoning, if that is what is going to be the basis to support that polygyny is somehow wrong, then we have to use the same line of reasoning when it comes to the other things prior to the fall. And that was that men didn't wear clothes. Women didn't wear clothes. They were naked. They also didn't eat meat. God gave them the green herbs, gave them the leaves, the fruits as their food, the vegetation as their food. So we weren't carnivorous at that point in time. So if we're gonna go back to before the fall, before sin came as the basis for what marriage should be, then that means we shouldn't be wearing clothes. That means your woman, your man, you should have no problem when they leave out the house without any clothes on tomorrow. And when you want that steak dinner, that chicken dinner, you need to put that down because Jesus came and he died on the cross. Then that means we can no longer eat meat. That it's a sin to eat meat. And Jesus himself ate fish. That is the problem with that line of reasoning. The problem is that there is a stretch I notice when individuals throw out these objections because they want and they are married to the cultural norms, and I get it. They are afraid of divorcing themselves from it. Just the very idea of polygyny in and of itself is frightening to particularly many women of this culture because of the power that comes with monogamy or prescriptive monogamy or forced monogamy that a woman has and attains when she is the one and only woman. And to give up that status, it becomes very frightening, particularly in this day and particularly in this culture. But the objection that polygyny is wrong because God only made one woman for the first man, that is a weak argument. The other thing about that argument is that if we're going to use that as an argument, we have to realize that that is only an assumption that Adam would not have had another wife had there never been any sin. They didn't live long enough apart from sin for us to know whether if God was going to allow Adam to have another wife. Because you got to remember, God allowed relatives that is considered later on in scripture to be taboo to procreate. You know, Cain had a wife, and the Seth had a wife who were descendants of Adam and Eve. But where did they get these wives from? Obviously, they were relatives of theirs. It was either a sister or a niece that they married and cohabitated with and had children and procreated with. So the idea of saying that because in the very beginning you don't see multiple wives being given to Adam, that automatically denotes that that's what God wanted and that's what the model was going to be and that's what he intended from the very beginning. We don't know that because scripture is silent on this. So to speak where the scripture is not speaking, I think, is to make an error. So the fact of the matter is that we just simply don't know if God never intended from the very beginning to allow men to have multiple wives. But one thing we do see is that God certainly does not give a nod against it anywhere else in scripture. Looks like I'm going to have to cut into this video segment at this time, and I'm going to pick it up in the next few days. Hopefully you guys are getting some value from this content as we're dealing with this subject of the objections that people have to polygamy. And we're going to pick it up on the next time. I'm having fun, and hopefully, as I said, you guys are enjoying this as well. But on another note, there's a brother by the name of Hondo Solomon who reached out to me when I posted my first video in the last series that I did a few weeks ago. Hondo is a well-respected, I would consider him an authoritative in this particular subject. He has traveled the world. He has he's well known in this field, and he released a book several years back called The Polygamist Papers. Well, he's now getting ready to release a new volume of his work, and it is called The Polygamist Papers, and the book itself covers the introduction of the subject of polygamy, the culture, the ethics, the pitfalls. It is a great read. One thing about Solomon that I appreciate is that the brother definitely believes in sourcing his work. He is going to beat you in the head with sources. But with that, I'm going to add his link to the bottom of the screen in my description. area. And just do check the book out, get a copy, and share it with others. But with that said, I'm gonna break in and I'm gonna leave at this point. And until next time, keep digging in the word. God bless. Take care.